A client recently asked me a great question about using stories in her content. And using that question as fuel for my own, I'm going to share that story with you in this week's episode on making stories work for your content. We're going to get into the elusive origin story a little bit more, telling customer stories without sharing all the details, and everyday stories and why I think, again, they're so great. You can look forward to all that and more stories in this week's riveting episode of Content with Character. Welcome to Content with Character, the weekly podcast that'll give you the momentum you need to create content with more ease, clarity, and laughter. I'm your host, content copywriter Emily Aborn, and I'm all about unconventional marketing approaches. I believe in your big ideas, and I'm excited to help you share them in a way that's distinctly you. Whenever I come home from a trip or even just an action-packed day out in the real world, I am always so excited to come home and tell my husband all of these stories about the adventure. My brain works very chronologically and always has, so I will weave together the story as a bit of an unfolding of mini stories along a timeline. So by the time I finished telling about the trip, I've told not just one story, but like 50 mini stories, and they're all like in exact order. And I do the same thing if somebody asks me how my day is or how I'm doing. I don't usually respond with an adjective or two, but I respond with a story about why the adjective is the one that I chose. I just did this to my poor friend Samantha the other day, and I'm sorry to my poor husband and all of my dear friends who put up with my brain working this way. I've been like this since I was a kid, and I was the one in high school who always had a story about the simple drive to school or the cereal that she ate that morning. Like there was just always something in there that was a story. That time in my life, they were not as good as they are now, let me tell you. Just kidding. People are always asking me about infusing and telling stories in their content because we hear it everywhere. We hear stories. Now, I think for one thing, people see me as a person who tells a lot of stories, which I don't think I ever actually saw in myself until I became a business owner. But I also think that people see me as somebody who's able to take this random thing that happened, which is very true, and I'm able to turn it into a lesson, a podcast episode, or an insight. My brain just kind of works like that. I'm very wired for story, and I'm very wired on to reflect on it and like turn it into something that could be beneficial or helpful to myself or to you. So the good news is, while I might be a little far on the story spectrum, your brain is wired for story as well. And so is your clients and so is your customers. So the key in using stories is to do it in a way that feels natural, feels simple, and feels doable to you. You don't need to be like me. Definitely I wouldn't recommend that because I do go overboard on micro details often. So I wouldn't advise my strategy for anyone. But you'll do it in a way that feels really, really good and true to who you are, distinctly you, as I like to say on this podcast. So we're going to talk a lot about stories. We're going to get into them a little bit more. And if you want some storytelling fun after this episode, I will make sure I include links in the show notes to some storytelling episodes we've done on this show, as well as one that I did with Kendra Hall on my former She Built This podcast as well. She came in and talked about the 4 different types of stories she recommends people tell in their business. And it was a really good episode. So you'll get more storytelling fun if you want to keep the learning going by checking out the show notes. My goal with this is really to inspire you to bring in more stories, but not get stuck in overthinking or worrying about it every single time that you do. So, real quick, before we get into the good stuff, I like to introduce myself in case you're new here or in case you zone out every single time I introduce myself. I'm Emily Aborn. I'm a copywriter, podcaster, and content marketing consultant. I help small business owners bring in personality, story, strategy, creative ideas, all that good stuff into their website copy, brand messaging, and beyond. So to connect with me in any or all of the places, always links are in the show notes. I'm good about that. Or you can just visit emilyaborn.com, which recently has been spruced up a little bit. So maybe there's your reason to go visit it. Happy New Year to me. All right, without further ado, let's get into the storytelling fun, making stories work for your content. You don't need me to tell you because you're pretty much going to see it everywhere. There is a huge buzz around storytelling in your business. Tell more stories. Tell more stories. Stories, stories, stories. There are ideas galore on what these stories should consist of. And honestly, even for a person who loves a good story, I will admit I feel very overwhelmed a lot of times by the advice out there. Like 99% of the time. But I do also know that it is important and beneficial for your content and for you to unlock some of your own internal creativity. It can help your brand and message be more memorable. It can help you build trust, relatability, emotional connection. It shows the benefits of your products and services better than you can ever tell by just talking about the features, which is what a story we're going to get into in next week's episode. And there are also tons of different stories you can share in your content. And I would encourage you to have fun and unlock your creativity in some of these different ways. But here's just like a smattering of what you could share in your content. Your origin story, that defining moment, lessons from failure, turning points, client success stories, before and after, the first sale, behind the product, team stories, case studies, this happened to me, customer journey stories, funny stories, metaphors, the list goes on and on. And I think I might even actually someday take the list I made and do more episodes specific to those because there are a lot and there's a lot of fun we can have with it. But suffice it to say that when we see all these options out there, it can feel really, really overwhelming. And also, you don't want content that's just story after story after story after story because sometimes stories are not what you need to share in the moment. Some stories don't need to be shared at all until the moment has long passed. So let's just focus on 3 that I was like, you know what? These are 3 simple stories you can make work in your content. You can sit down and jot them down for yourself and set them into motion right away. And I'm going to make them as easy as possible for you. So the first one I want to address is the origin story. And I did do a whole episode on this, so make sure you check out the link in the show notes. This is a story about how you started your business, why you started your business, challenges you overcame in starting your business, successes and wins, maybe your why, and how it really does help you to express your purpose, your values, why you care so much. And it can be a little bit elusive and like hard to write. Like, I don't know, where do I start, right? Like, it is actually hard to come up with a concise, clear, meaningful origin story. And it's one you're going to probably workshop time and time and time again and use it in different ways, which I do talk about in that origin story episode. So to make it a little bit simpler, this is not my original concept. This is called the Pixar pitch, or the Once Upon a Time framework. They use it a lot when storyboarding, I think movies and concepts, and they also use it a lot in improv. And I just find it to be really simple and helpful for a lot of people. So I'm going to include, there's going to be a link in the show notes that says extended show notes. And if you follow that link, you'll get to this all written out because I wanted to give you like a visual as well as just me saying auditorily. But basically it has 6 pieces to it. So you start the story just like, you might start a kid's bedtime story. Once upon a time. This is where you're going to set the scene, introduce the main character. So example, once upon a time, there was a girl named Emily who dreamed of one day opening her own business. Second part, and every day. And so in that, you describe the regular, unchanging world of this person. Example, every day she locked herself in her room and dreamt of being a writer while sitting on her metal radiator staring out the window. She dreamt of being a shop owner or being on the radio or owning her own bed and breakfast. Until part 3, until one day, and this is where you're going to introduce that catalyst or change that disrupts her everyday. So like something happened where she's now, her status quo has changed. Example, until one day, she finally took the leap into entrepreneurship and started a mattress shop with her husband. Part 4, because of that. So this is where you're going to show the consequences or the reactions to the change. Now, this part you might actually repeat multiple times. So you might say, because of that, blank. Because of that, blank. Because of that, blank. So example, because of that, she realized she loved creating content and marketing pieces for business. Because of that, she decided to help other business owners with their content marketing and close down her mattress store. Because of that, she niched down just into her one true passion, which was copywriting. And then part 5, until finally, and this is where we're going to resolve the whole thing. And I want to say I'm not doing this perfectly as we're going along, but I'm just doing my best on the fly. So until finally, she found her sweet spot where all of her dreams culminated into a dream business, and she finally had the business she always wanted. Number 6, and ever since then, and this is where I'll describe the lasting impact of my story or my new normal. Ever since then, she's been world's happiest business owner and loves helping other business owners shine through their content, copywriting, and marketing. So I do find it beneficial to take this exact framework, and it might feel a little cheesy, okay? But it's really a good activity for you to do, and you can write your origin story this way. Then you can doctor that up to be a little bit more eloquent or a little bit more you, right? But it's a good way to start, and that's why I like this once upon a time framework, because it really does help to condense it quite a bit. And what you're going to also do is distill down the really, really important pieces. Obviously, I did not share all the detail of those pieces in my story due to the nature of time, of course. I just cut to the highlights, and that's what this framework really allows you to do. And then you can use that story on your website, on your about page, as a social media post, on an email, on a podcast. And I have cautioned you this before. Make sure that when you're doing your origin story, you are making it relevant to the person reading or listening. If you're just going to straight origin story it, make sure you make it relevant. I bet you can think of other places to apply it as well. Your LinkedIn profile, I just thought of, might be a good fun spot to try it. So try it out, try it with this framework, and then go ahead and go back and make it a little bit more you-ified, right? But have fun sharing what brought you to where you are. That's your origin story. Second type I want to get into in this episode, making stories work for your content, making it really, really simple, is client stories. Now, I have a lot of thoughts on client stories that I realized I didn't share in my first go-round with client stories. But I think we're going to just keep a little bit of that going throughout the year. I love client stories for so many reasons, and I'm focusing heavily on them this year myself. They give social proof. They help your future clients see themselves in tangible examples and stories and transformations. And they also highlight those results that you do give people. So it's a great way to show people what you actually do without telling them every single feature. You can share bits of your process. You can share what makes you different. You can share what makes your clients your clients. It's really, really fantastic. Now, here's something that might pop into your mind with the client stories. A consulting client recently had this conundrum. She asked me a great question about sharing client stories in her content, but she said that a lot of hers end up being confidential or personal or about somebody in her network, and maybe she doesn't want them to see it. So what then? What do I do then? Where does that leave her with sharing those stories? I love being specific in our stories. I think it's fantastic. And the more specific we can be, I always say the better. But sometimes you don't want to be wildly specific for reasons just like those, for reasons that it is confidential or it is personal or it is about somebody in your network and they might read it or see it. So here are some ideas I came up with that will still allow you to share the stories, any of your client stories, without upsetting your clients, colleagues, friends, or having to share from inside the depths of your own personal world. Number 1, ask their permission. Before I shared this client story, I actually did ask her permission. And I said, do you mind if I use this as an example? I'm not going to say your name. I'm not going to say what your business is or any of that would give you away. I would love to share your story in my podcast. And she said, yes, no problem. Number 2, you could muddy up the details. Now, this is going to take some creative license, but you could really seriously skew those details a little bit to make it a story that ends up not actually being about them. It's just kind of like a vague-ish story, right? So it's not specific. It's just vague. Number 3, you can conglomerate multiple stories. And I like this. I could have said, clients ask me this all the time, and here's the problem that comes up for them. Or I could have shown you 3 different ways they might ask me the same question, or 3 different ways they get in their head about it. So you can kind of mix and match common themes of things that you hear and turn them into one. And then number 4, you can do that. You can marry any of these techniques. But number 4 is just creating a completely fictional character and telling their story instead. In fact, I often think about writing a book, like a personal book, and I think to myself, it would actually probably be more beneficial if I did it fictionally, because then I could tell some of these stories without it being a real person per se. Here's kind of a general rule of thumb. If it's a story that when they hear it told about them, they're going to beam and be so happy that you shared it, and you're sure of that, then by all means, go ahead and share it. If in doubt, go back and ask them for permission, or use any of those other three kind of options. And if you're really in doubt and you're questioning and you're like, it's keeping you up at night, whether or not to share or don't share, just think of a different story. You probably aren't supposed to be telling that one. Client stories are not just limited to before and afters. They can also be the questions that they ask you, like that one. They can be funny moments or misconceptions or misunderstandings. Your first client, your favorite client, the most successful, a client you didn't actually think you could help, but you ended up being able to help them. A client that surprised you, a lesson you learned from a client, how you maybe upgraded your approach thanks to a client. Don't just stop at those simple before and afters, those simple case studies. I do love them, and I do plan to bring more of them into my own content this year, but try to think outside the box and look for client stories, great and small, and share them all as much as you can. Third type we're going to get into today, behind the scenes and everyday stories. Why on earth would anyone want to know about my life, Emily? Well, I had somebody ask me this kind of recently, like, why would I share those? First of all, I think that they're fun, and weirdos attract other weirdos. So share your weirdness. We're all weirdos in some way. Number two, they are relatable. They show a little bit more about you. They can show a little bit more about your workday, your process, your values, your personality, the way you work. You can weave in lessons when applicable, which I love doing. I am a lesson finder. Like I said, I can go to the grocery store and come up with a life lesson, okay? And other stories to tell are actually like the mishaps, the mistakes, the humorous moments, the wins, the flops, the defining moments, the personal challenges. There are a lot in there. And if you don't want to get too specific when you're talking about yourself, you can actually use those 4 principles that we talked about for client stories. You can ask yourself for permission. If you're like, not so sure, then go ahead and muddy up those details, or create a conglomeration of multiple stories, or create a fictional character, right? So bouncing off of that anti-bro marketing podcast episode we did last week, let's also keep in mind, we want to make sure that our stories are not sleazy or shisty. We're doing this because of the love of it and because we want to connect with people on the other side. We don't want to be doing this from a place of nefarious intention. So here are some of the things that I try to remember to keep me sort of centered on that, right? Like when I'm about to tell a story, to make sure I'm doing it from the right place, mindfully, and with the right intentions, I ask myself these 4 questions. Number 1, is this my story to share? If not, I may just need to ask for permission first, and then it might be fine. Number 2, will sharing this hurt or embarrass somebody else? Number 3, am I being honest or am I exaggerating? Now, a little bit of creative license is fine, but lying and exaggerating wildly, not fine. Number 4, why am I sharing this story? And because Emily told me to is not the answer that you want to come up with for that question. That's fun and nice and everything, but I want you to dig a little bit deeper. Why am I sharing this story? So my best practical tips, I wanted to give you just like 3 things I do on a regular basis to find and collect my stories, because I like to share them, but sometimes I'm like, oh my God, I should share that. And then I forget, right? So here are 3 things I do every single month to know which stories I want to share where. First of all, I keep a story vault, and that's just like a list of ideas or moments or client wins or client questions that you can draw from later. I put these I keep a monthly Google Doc with all of the content, not like day by day, but like monthly content that I'm sharing. And so I'll just kind of jot down my story bullet points under there. Number 2, go ahead and open your eyes to looking for, or ears, to looking for the lessons or insights in everyday moments. Give yourself a minute take 5 after a call that you've just had and ask yourself, was there a lesson or an insight or a story in there? When you get home from the grocery store, give yourself 2 seconds to reflect, pause. When you come back from an appointment, reflect, pause. Journaling is actually hugely beneficial for this. For me, I often find, there's actually like a cool little story or parallel in there. And then another one you can do, which is super simple and practical, is just using prompts. AI actually has some really, you can use Google or AI to get story prompts, which I think is fantastic. And I also got this book a long, long time ago by an author, Brittany Long. It's not like a book, like read it start to finish. It's called Story Stash, and it's labeled an email marketing journal, but I think you could use the stories for like pretty much anything in your marketing. So it's a really good one. I'll put that in the show notes. I got it for a group that went through my marketing momentum lab once, and we had a lot of fun with it. So that's another way you can do it too. Just using different prompts, whether it be through a book or through AI or something that you Google. You can come up with a lot of great stories. All right. Ready for a micro dose of marketing for the week? This week, I'm going to encourage or challenge or invite you to find one story, just one. You only have to find one and share it in your content. It could be one of the 3 that we discussed if you want an A+. And if you want an A, you can just pick a story of your own. No, I'm totally kidding. But we are going to come back to a lot of these throughout the year. So just remember that when you're telling a story, to approach it thoughtfully and with kindness. And I think that's one of the keys in making stories work for your content, even if they are about somebody else. Okay. So next week, I'm actually going to tell you a story. I'm going to tell you a story about a zipper. Yes, a zipper. And we are going to show you what that has to do with your marketing. I will chat with you then. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Content with Character. If you loved the episode, please make sure to subscribe to the podcast, rate, review, and share it with someone else you know it could help. For more content and visibility tips, visit my blog at emilyaborn.com, and be sure to connect with me on Instagram at Emily Aborn. I'd love to hear how this inspired you to take action.